The room was quiet except for the soft hum of stage lights cooling down. Backstage, a child sat trembling in a wheelchair, tears slipping down their cheeks, while a man in a black fedora knelt beside them. In that suspended moment between music and humanity, Michael Jackson would hear 5 words that would end a powerful career forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. This is not just a backstage anecdote. This is a story about power, cruelty, compassion, and a line that should never be crossed. It's the story of how a tour manager earning over $300,000 a year lost everything in a single breath, and how Michael Jackson reminded the world what it truly meant to be human. The tour was massive, a moving city of lights, sound, and ambition. Every night tens of thousands screamed as Michael Jackson stepped onto the stage, transforming arenas into temples of rhythm and emotion. Behind the spectacle, a tightly controlled machine operated with military precision. Schedules were sacred, delays were unforgivable, and authority flowed from the top down, enforced by men who believed the show mattered more than anything else. Including people. That day the child had been granted a rare backstage visit. Frail, exhausted, fighting an illness that had already taken so much, they clutched a doll dressed like Michael Jackson, holding onto it like a lifeline. For them, this meeting wasn't a luxury. It was a miracle. Doctors had signed off. Families had prayed. Time was not a promise, it was a question. But not everyone saw it that way. The tour manager stormed into the hallway, irritated by whispers of delay. The rehearsal schedule was tight. Cameras were waiting. The machine needed to move. When he saw the child, pale and struggling to breathe, his face hardened instead of softening. According to witnesses, his voice cut through the room like broken glass. "I don't care if he's dying." The words hung in the air, heavy, poisonous, irreversible. Someone tried to explain. Someone begged for patience. The manager waved them off. He said the child was a distraction. He said Michael Jackson had a show to do. He said the world didn't stop for one sick kid. But the world did stop. Because Michael Jackson had heard him. Michael had been walking down the corridor, already in costume, already carrying the weight of the stage on his shoulders. When those words reached him, he froze. Witnesses say his expression changed instantly, not anger first, but disbelief, as if his mind refused to accept that such words could exist in the same space as him. He stepped forward quietly. Michael knelt beside the child, placing a gentle hand on their shoulder. He spoke softly, asking their name, complimenting their bravery, telling them how strong they were. The child smiled through tears. For a moment the illness disappeared. There was only connection. Then Michael Jackson stood up. He turned to the tour manager. The hallway was silent now. Crew members held their breath. No one had ever seen Michael look like this, not furious, not explosive, but cold with clarity. "Pack your things," Michael said. The manager laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Power had insulated him for years. Money, authority, access. "I don't tolerate that," Michael Jackson continued. "You're fired." 5 words, calm, final. "Pack your things, you're fired." A $300,000 career ended without a raised voice, without a meeting, without a second chance. The man tried to protest. He talked about contracts, logistics, consequences. Michael didn't listen. He had already turned back to the child. And in that moment, the tour manager understood something too late. This wasn't just a pop star. This was a man who had drawn a moral line long before fame ever found him. To understand why Michael Jackson reacted the way he did, you have to understand his past. Michael didn't grow up protected from suffering. He grew up inside it. A child himself when the world demanded perfection, he understood vulnerability in a way few adults ever could. Pain wasn't theoretical to him. It was memory. That's why hospitals became sanctuaries for him. That's why children mattered more than schedules. That's why he never saw illness as inconvenience, but as a call to compassion. For Michael, the child in that wheelchair wasn't interrupting the show. They were the reason for it. After the manager was escorted out, the tour didn't collapse. The world didn't end. If anything, something invisible but essential had been restored. Crew members later said morale shifted that night. People remembered why they were there, why the music mattered. Michael spent extra time with the child. He signed the doll. He whispered encouragement. He promised them they were loved. Some say the child passed away not long after. Some say they lived longer than expected. What matters is not the ending but the moment. A moment where dignity won over dominance. For the fired tour manager, the consequences were immediate and lasting. In an industry built on reputation, word spread fast. No one wanted to hire the man who had been dismissed by Michael Jackson for cruelty. Meetings were canceled. Calls went unanswered. Doors closed quietly, the way they always do when respect is lost. Money disappeared. Influence vanished. And all that remained were 5 words he would never forget. For Michael, the incident was never publicized by him. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't tell the story on talk shows. Because for Michael Jackson, compassion was not a headline, it was a default setting. That's what made him dangerous to people who valued power over people. Years later, fans would see photographs from Backstage. Michael crouched beside sick children, smiling softly, eyes full of concern. To some, they were just images. To others, they were proof. Proof that behind the sequins and spotlights was someone who never stopped seeing the world through a human lens. This story resurfaced long after his passing, shared in whispers by crew members who had been there. Each retelling carried the same conclusion. They had witnessed something rare, not celebrity drama, not ego. Moral authority. In an industry that often rewards cruelty masked as efficiency, Michael Jackson chose kindness, even when it cost nothing and gained him nothing but integrity. And that is why this story still matters. Because it reminds us that greatness is not measured by applause, but by what you do when no one is watching. It reminds us that power reveals character, and that a single sentence can expose everything a person truly believes. I don't care if he's dying. Those words destroyed one career. 5 different words defined another. Pack your things, you're fired. Not because of money, not because of mistakes, but because compassion is not optional. As the lights dimmed that night and the crowd roared, Michael Jackson stepped onto the stage once more. The audience saw a legend. But backstage, those who knew the truth saw something even greater. They saw a man who chose humanity over hierarchy. And that choice still echoes. The echoes of that night did not end when the stage lights went dark. Long after the crowd had left, long after the final note faded into silence, the story continued to ripple quietly through corridors of power, memory, and conscience. What happened backstage that day became something more than an incident. It became a turning point, one that revealed the invisible code Michael Jackson lived by, a code that often clashed violently with the machinery around him. For the crew, the firing of the tour manager was not just shocking, it was destabilizing. This was a man who controlled schedules, logistics, security clearances, and access to Michael himself. He was feared, not respected. And fear in an industry like this often masquerades as competence. Many had tolerated his behavior for years because the tour ran smoothly, because money flowed, because complaints were buried under success. But Michael Jackson saw what others ignored. In the hours after the dismissal, whispers filled the backstage areas. Some were relieved, others were anxious. There were questions about legal fallout, about contracts, about retaliation. Michael listened calmly, then said something that stunned everyone again. "If he wants to sue, let him," Michael said softly. "I'll stand by what I did." That sentence mattered, because it revealed something critical. Michael understood the cost of moral decisions, and he was willing to pay it. The legal team panicked. Advisors warned him about optics. Executives suggested framing the dismissal as a restructuring decision. Michael refused. He didn't want spin. He didn't want excuses. He didn't want the truth softened for comfort. The truth was simple. Cruelty had crossed a line, and Michael Jackson would not let that line move. As the tour continued, a subtle but powerful shift occurred. Crew members began to speak more freely. Small acts of kindness multiplied. Assistants checked on fans backstage with more care. Security softened their edges when children were involved. It was as if the entire ecosystem recalibrated itself around one undeniable fact: empathy was now policy. This wasn't accidental. Michael reinforced it every day. He asked about sick fans. He requested updates. He made time even when exhausted, sometimes especially when exhausted. People close to him say that on days when his body ached the most, his patience for suffering increased, not decreased. Pain to Michael was a shared language, and that language shaped everything he did. Behind closed doors, the fired tour manager's fall accelerated. Attempts to spin his dismissal failed. The industry knew Michael's silence was deliberate, and silence from Michael Jackson was often louder than any statement. When potential employers reached out discreetly for references, they didn't receive elaborate explanations. They received pauses, and pauses in this business are fatal. No one wanted to be associated with someone removed for lacking humanity, especially not by Michael. But this story is not only about punishment, it's about contrast. Because while one career ended, another kind of legacy deepened. Over the years, stories like this accumulated quietly, stacking atop one another like invisible bricks. A nurse recalled Michael staying hours past schedule at a children's hospital, singing softly so as not to disturb other patients. A security guard remembered Michael insisting that a disabled fan be carried closer to the stage, ignoring production complaints. A stagehand remembered Michael halting rehearsal because a child in the crowd looked frightened by the noise. These were not PR moments. There were no cameras, no press releases, only choices. And choice is where character lives. Critics often accused Michael Jackson of living in fantasy, of being disconnected from reality. But stories like this reveal the opposite. Michael was painfully aware of reality, especially its cruelty, and he refused to let that cruelty become normal. The irony is striking. A man accused by tabloids of being strange, immature, or detached was often the most emotionally grounded person in the room. He recognized suffering instantly, not because he romanticized it, but because he had survived it. Childhood fame had stolen his innocence, but it had sharpened his empathy. And empathy was his weapon. The incident with the tour manager also sent a message far beyond that single tour. Industry insiders noticed. Promoters adjusted behavior. Managers reconsidered how they spoke around Michael. There was a new understanding. Talent might buy access, but values determined permanence. Michael was not naive. He knew cruelty existed. He had seen it in boardrooms, courtrooms, and headlines. But he also knew something else. Cruelty depended on silence. And he refused to be silent. Years later, after Michael's death, this story resurfaced again and again, each time with more detail, more weight. People who had been afraid to speak while he was alive began to talk, not to defend him, not to mythologize him, but to testify. They wanted the world to understand who he really was. One crew member said it best: Michael didn't just fire that man, he protected something sacred. That sacred thing was dignity. And dignity, once protected, has a way of spreading. The child in the wheelchair became a symbol among the crew, not of tragedy, but of truth. A reminder that behind every ticket, every scream, every sold-out arena, there were human beings whose lives mattered more than profit. Michael never forgot that. In fact, it haunted him. Those close to him say he often asked, late at night, whether he had done enough, whether he had helped enough people, whether he could have done more. Fame to Michael was not validation, it was responsibility. And responsibility weighed heavy. There were nights when he cried alone, replaying moments like that backstage incident in his mind, not because he doubted his decision, but because he wondered how many other children had been dismissed before he arrived, how many voices had been ignored when he wasn't there to hear them. That question never left him. It fueled his philanthropy, his hospital visits, his donations, his insistence on creating spaces for children to feel safe and seen. Neverland was not escapism, it was restoration. A place where childhood could exist without fear. And fear in Michael's world was the true enemy. The fired tour manager never publicly apologized. Some say he blamed Michael until the end. Others say regret eventually found him in quiet moments. But remorse, when it comes too late, changes nothing. What changed everything were those 5 words. Pack your things, you're fired. They became legend not because of their harshness, but because of their clarity. They were not spoken in anger. They were spoken in defense of something larger than authority. Humanity. And that is why this story endures. In a world that often celebrates dominance, Michael Jackson chose compassion. In an industry addicted to speed, he chose pause. In a system built on silence, he chose to speak. And when he spoke, careers ended. But something else began. A reminder that greatness is not measured by how many people serve you, but by how many you serve. That power is meaningless without mercy. And that sometimes, the most important performance happens far away from the stage. The silence that followed his death made stories like this louder. When Michael Jackson was alive, many of the people who witnessed moments like the firing of that tour manager stayed quiet out of loyalty, fear, or respect for Michael's privacy. But after he was gone, something shifted. The absence created a vacuum, and into that space poured memories, unfiltered, unpolished, and deeply human. One by one, those who had been there began to speak, not to build a legend, but to correct a narrative that had been bent for decades. Because for too long, the world had been told who Michael Jackson was by people who never stood beside him when it mattered. The backstage incident became a reference point. Crew members would mention it in hushed conversations, almost like a moral compass. Remember what happened on that tour, they'd say. Remember why that guy got fired. It was shorthand for something deeper. Don't forget who Michael really was. In the months following that tour, a noticeable change occurred in how children were treated at shows. Access protocols shifted. Medical clearances were handled with more care. Backstage areas were made calmer, quieter, less intimidating. It wasn't written into any official handbook, but everyone understood. Michael had set a precedent. And precedents once set have power. Michael never framed himself as a savior. In fact, he hated that language. Those close to him say he flinched whenever someone called him an angel or a saint. He didn't see kindness as heroism. He saw it as obligation. To him, fame was a debt he could never fully repay. That's what made the contrast with the tour manager so stark. Where one man saw inconvenience, Michael saw urgency. Where one saw weakness, Michael saw courage. Where one saw a schedule, Michael saw a soul. And souls mattered to him more than anything. This wasn't performative empathy. It wasn't selective. Michael's compassion extended even to people who had hurt him. He forgave easily, sometimes to his own detriment. Advisors begged him to be more guarded. Lawyers warned him that kindness could be exploited. Michael listened politely, then did what he always did. He chose mercy. But mercy, when misunderstood, can look like vulnerability. And vulnerability, in a ruthless world, is often punished. That punishment came later in the form of accusations, headlines, and relentless scrutiny. The same industry that quietly admired Michael's humanity often failed to defend him publicly when he needed it most. Silence returned, but this time it was Michael's choice. Yet even then, stories like the one about the fired tour manager refused to disappear. Because truth has a strange resilience. Former staff members described how Michael reacted when he saw suffering. His body language changed, his voice softened, his entire focus narrowed. It didn't matter if the person was a child, a janitor, or a stranger passing by. Pain commanded his attention. One assistant recalled Michael stopping a convoy because he saw someone crying on the side of the road. Security protested. Schedules screamed. Michael insisted. He rolled down the window and asked if they were okay. This was not myth-making. This was habit. And habits reveal who we are when no one is watching. The firing of the tour manager also revealed something else. Michael's quiet authority. Despite the public perception of him as fragile or easily controlled, moments like that exposed the truth. When it came to values, Michael was immovable. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He decided. That decisiveness shocked people because it contradicted the caricature they had been fed. Michael Jackson was not passive. He was principled, and principles once violated met consequences. The irony is that many of the same people who dismissed Michael as eccentric benefited from the moral environment he created. They worked on tour where compassion was normalized because Michael demanded it. They earned money in spaces where cruelty was discouraged because Michael refused to tolerate it. And yet when narratives were written, these truths were often left out. Why? Because they didn't fit. They complicated the story. They reminded the world that Michael Jackson was not easily categorized. He wasn't just a performer. He wasn't just a celebrity. He wasn't even just an icon. He was a moral actor in a system that preferred compliance. And systems resist that. After Michael's passing, the child-centered charities he supported quietly continued their work. Some hospitals kept letters he had written framed on their walls. Nurses remembered his gentleness. Doctors remembered his questions, detailed, sincere, informed. Michael didn't just show up. He paid attention. Attention is love's most concrete form. That child backstage, the one dismissed so cruelly, became part of a larger pattern. A pattern of Michael stepping in where others stepped away. A pattern of choosing the human over the efficient. And patterns, once recognized, tell a story more powerful than any single incident. The fired tour manager faded into obscurity. His name, once powerful, became a cautionary tale, not because he was fired, but because of why. People didn't remember his success. They remembered his sentence. I don't care if he's dying. In contrast, Michael's sentence echoed with a different weight. Pack your things, you're fired. It wasn't revenge. It was boundary. And boundaries define legacy. As years passed, fans began to reassess what they thought they knew. They listened differently. They watched footage with new eyes. They noticed how often Michael's attention drifted toward children in crowds, toward fans in distress, toward moments that had nothing to do with applause. They began to see a pattern the media had ignored. Michael Jackson's greatest performances often happened offstage. This is why stories like this matter now more than ever. Not to sanctify him, not to erase complexity, but to restore balance. To remind the world that behind the noise, there was a man who made hard choices quietly and paid for them willingly. In an era obsessed with optics, Michael chose substance. In an industry driven by fear, he chose care. And when someone crossed a line that threatened the dignity of a dying child, Michael didn't hesitate. He acted. That action still resonates because it challenges us. It asks uncomfortable questions. Would we do the same? Would we risk convenience, money, or reputation to protect someone with no power? Michael did. And that is why, long after the music stops, his humanity continues to speak. The stage lights fade, the crowds disperse, the headlines change. But somewhere in a quiet backstage hallway, a moment still exists. A man kneeling beside a child, choosing compassion, and 5 words that proved character is revealed not by success, but by response. What makes this story endure is not just the shock of what happened, but the silence that followed, and what that silence revealed about Michael Jackson. After that tour ended, Michael never spoke publicly about the incident. No interviews, no memoir excerpts, no subtle hints in lyrics. He let the moment exist exactly as it was, private, intact, and unexploited. For someone whose life had been consumed by public interpretation, that restraint was intentional. Michael understood something most celebrities never learn. Some truths lose their power when they are performed. And yet, the people who witnessed it were changed forever. One lighting technician later said that before that day, he treated the job like a machine. We build, we run, we tear down. People are obstacles. After seeing Michael fire the tour manager, he said something in him broke open. I realized we were all replaceable except our humanity. That realization spread quietly. Not through memos, not through policy, but through example. Michael's authority didn't come from fear. It came from moral gravity. When he walked into a room, people adjusted themselves, not because they were scared of him, but because they wanted to meet the standard he carried without announcing. This is something rarely discussed when talking about Michael Jackson, how deeply intentional he was about the emotional environment around him. He believed cruelty was contagious. He also believed kindness was contagious, and he knew exactly which one he wanted multiplying in his orbit. That's why the tour manager's words were unforgivable, not because they were offensive, but because they threatened to normalize indifference. And Michael understood that once indifference is accepted, everything else follows. Neglect, abuse, silence. Michael had lived through all three. As a child star, he learned early that adults could look directly at suffering and keep moving. He learned how easily people justify harm when profit or reputation is involved. He learned how pain becomes invisible when it's inconvenient. And he swore, quietly, privately, that he would never become that kind of adult. That vow followed him everywhere. It followed him into recording studios where executives dismissed vulnerable artists. It followed him into boardrooms where numbers mattered more than people. It followed him onto tour where exhaustion was treated like weakness. And on that day backstage, it followed him straight into confrontation. The fired tour manager represented everything Michael rejected: efficiency without empathy, power without conscience, control without care. Michael didn't need to raise his voice because his decision came from alignment, not emotion. People often mistake gentleness for passivity. Michael Jackson was gentle. He was not passive. After the firing, some crew members worried Michael would face backlash, that the industry would punish him quietly, that he'd be labeled difficult, emotional, unprofessional. Those labels had followed him before. Michael knew that too. But he also knew something else. Once you compromise your values to protect your position, the position is already gone. So he stood firm. And the backlash never came, not because the industry suddenly grew a conscience, but because Michael was too powerful to challenge on that ground. His success shielded his morality in ways others didn't have the privilege to experience, and he used that privilege deliberately. He became a firewall, not just for children, but for anyone vulnerable within his sphere. There were times when assistants would quietly redirect sick fans to Michael's presence, knowing he would make time even when he shouldn't. Times when doctors warned him about exposure risks, and Michael listened carefully, then asked if the child needed him. He never framed it as sacrifice. He framed it as connection. And connection was Michael's true language. This is why the world's misunderstanding of him cut so deeply. Because the same compassion that led him to protect children was twisted into suspicion by people who could not imagine kindness without agenda. Michael felt that contradiction intensely. He once told a close confidant that being kind in a cruel world makes you look guilty. "People don't trust gentleness," he said. "They think there must be something wrong with it." That awareness never hardened him. It saddened him. The incident with the tour manager haunted Michael not because of doubt, but because of clarity. It reminded him how thin the line was between protection and harm, and how easily that line is crossed when no one is watching. That's why he watched. Constantly. He noticed tone, body language, dismissiveness, the way power moved through rooms, and when something felt wrong, he intervened, sometimes subtly, sometimes decisively. The firing was decisive. And because it was decisive, it echoed. Years later, when new artists worked with people who had been on Michael's tour, they heard the story. Sometimes it was told as a warning, sometimes as admiration, sometimes with disbelief. "Is it true he fired someone on the spot for that?" they asked. "Yes," came the answer, and no one argued. Because no one could. There was no moral defense for what the tour manager said, only rationalizations, and Michael did not accept rationalizations for cruelty. This matters now because we live in a world that constantly excuses harm under the language of productivity. We're told to move faster, care less, optimize everything, including people. Michael rejected that framework. He believed that art without humanity was noise, and humanity without protection was exploitation. So he protected it the only way he knew how, by acting when others hesitated. That's what separates passive goodness from active goodness. Active goodness costs something. It cost Michael relationships. It cost him trust in institutions. It cost him peace. But it gave him alignment. And alignment, for Michael Jackson, was survival. When people ask why he surrounded himself with children, why he created spaces like Neverland, why he seemed obsessed with innocence, this story offers an answer that is rarely acknowledged. Michael was not chasing childhood. He was defending it. Defending it from the same indifference he heard in that hallway. Defending it from the same adult callousness that told him, as a child, to keep performing no matter how tired, how scared, how hurt he was. He knew exactly what it meant to be told you don't matter. So when he heard those words spoken to another child, especially one fighting for their life, something ancient and unmovable rose in him. And he acted. That act didn't make headlines, it didn't sell records, it didn't fix the world. But it fixed that moment. And sometimes that's everything. Because history is not only shaped by grand gestures, it's shaped by private decisions that ripple outward long after the people involved are gone. This is one of those decisions. The child in the wheelchair may never know how many lives were affected by that moment. The fired tour manager may never fully understand what he lost, but Michael knew. He knew because he felt it in the stillness afterward, in the way the air changed, in the way people looked at him, not as a star but as a standard. And that standard remains. Long after the accusations, long after the controversies, long after the noise. This story survives because it speaks to something timeless. The idea that power does not excuse cruelty and success does not absolve indifference. Michael Jackson understood that deeply. And on that day backstage, he proved it, not with a song, not with a speech, but with 5 words spoken in defense of someone who had none. "Pack your things, you're fired." Not because the show mattered, but because the child did. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, please subscribe, like, and share. These narratives only survive when people choose truth over convenience, and your support keeps that truth alive.